Kia ora koutou katoa. So I'll start with a welcome and karakia. Tuia ki runga, unite above. Tuia ki raro, unite below. Tuia ki roto, unite without. Tuia ki waho, unite within. Ka rongo te ao, listen to the world. Ka rongo te po, listen to the night. Haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. So it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our Fabian's session. And before I introduce our guest speakers, I'll just do a little bit of the housekeeping. So the exit door is there. If there's a sudden need to vacate, we'll go out through that exit. Upstairs are the toilets. The men's are at the top of the stairs and the women's are through the glass doors. Keep on going on the left. I think that's all we need to tell everyone about that. After our speakers have done their presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session. We are recording, and so we're videoing live. Have we gone live yet? Oh, so welcome to our live audience. So I know you can hear everyone quite clearly when you stand up and speak here in this auditorium, but you can't be heard online, which is really frustrating for people who are viewing us online. So we're going to have a trial system tonight. There's bits of paper at the end of the rows. If you want to ask a question, please write your question out, and Paul will come down and speak it into the microphone so we can all hear. So let's get started with our first speaker, who is Greg, and is most probably well known to you all here. So he's a lawyer, a writer, and also is a local board member out in the Waitakaris. So Greg.
Kia ora koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, e ngā mate, haere atura. Ko Greg Presland tēnei. I'm Greg Presland. Just by way of background, I'm a lawyer. I've been a lawyer for the last 40 years. I have a certain amount of experience of trusts and electoral law, and if you Google Greg Presland and Secret Trust, it'll give you an idea of my experience. And all I could say is that legal professional privilege prevents me from saying anything whatsoever about my activities, but I'm very happy to comment on general policy, and when I'm got my lawyer's hat on, I make legal decisions, not policy or political decisions. I'm also the chair of the Waitaki Rangers local board, and I blog for The Standard. Many years ago I set up an account as Mickey Savage at a time when I wanted to keep my personality or my persona private. I got outed a while ago, so I've accepted it, and I do like it, and I've kept writing under that name. So it's a big topic today. If you think of what happened during the last election, it felt like that the whole country was awash with money, and it was all funding one sort of publicity, and it was all negative, and the country was very grumpy, and the result was, with the benefit of hindsight, a foregone conclusion. A couple of months ago, I was reading The Guardian on a Sunday morning, as I do, and there was a George Monbiot article which really attracted my attention, and I first saw it via a tweet. And what the tweet said is, you would think that this is a wild and improbable conspiracy theory, but every fact in this column is checked and verified. How the Atlas Network dark money junk tanks steer policy around the world. And when I read that article, it really struck a chord with me, because I knew about the Atlas Network, and I knew about the effect of money in politics, and how the right always seemed to accumulate a lot of money, and it always popped up in very strange places. But it really reinforced to me that we're not talking about a local experience, we're talking about an international phenomena. And what Monbiot talked about was the election of Javier Milei as the Argentinian president, but he also made comments about the sort of activity that was being funded by Atlas and by the entities associated with Atlas. And he said this, next slide please. A crash program of massive cuts, demolishing public services, privatising public assets, centralising political power, sacking civil servants, sweeping away constraints on corporations and oligarchs, destroying regulations that protect workers, vulnerable people and the living world, supporting landlords against tenants, criminalising peaceful protest, restricting the right to strike. Anything ring a bell? And it sure did. And he was talking about experiences in Argentina and Britain. But with every single thing he said there, I kept thinking of good old New Zealand. And so I then wrote a post. And next slide, please. And just going through some of the steps that this government have taken. First of all, massive cuts. Well, Nicola Willis, her mini budget proposed $7.4 billion worth of cuts. Demolishing public services and sacking civil servants. Well, David Seymour gleefully announced before Christmas thousands of public service cuts to jobs. Privatising public assets. The government's clearly actively considering PPPs for motorway projects. They've raised it for school construction projects. And you can bet that if anything isn't nailed down, they're going to look at some way of privatising it. Next one is sweeping away constraints on corporations and oligarchs. And we've got the introduction of the 90-day Fire at Will bill, removing fair pay agreements, which the oligarchs love. How about removing under urgency the IRD's review of the fairness of the tax system? And that was pushed through under urgency. And it makes you wonder what they wanted to hide, what they didn't want us to know. Or how about removing unemployment as a consideration for the Reserve Bank when setting interest rates? Or if you want a very specific example, how about Luxon getting a rather large payout for not living in Government House? Next bullet point, destroying regulations that protect workers. And again, getting rid of 90-day Fire at Will, or bringing in 90-day Fire at Will, and getting rid of fair pay agreements were classic examples of those. Next bullet point, destroying regulations that protect vulnerable people. Well, how about charging the way benefit increases for everyone except superannuants are calculated, so that over time there will be more child poverty? Or what about increasing sanctions on beneficiaries? Or again, removing unemployment as a factor the Reserve Bank has to think about when setting interest rates. Next bullet point, destroying regulations that protect the living world. Well, winding back the RMA is going to do that, and removing the clean car discount will mean that we produce more CO2. And Three Waters, which was designed in part to deal with climate change, getting rid of that means that that's another area that won't be addressed. And you might have heard today that the government's announced ministers having very grand powers to basically grant consents. And although they have to get expert advice on it, they've got the power to take away the environmental bits they don't like of that advice. So we are living in very unusual times. And finally, supporting landlords against tenants. Well, tax cuts for landlords are in progress, and they're planning to reinstate no-cause evictions for tenants, which is something a Labour government did, which I thought was very important. And all we need is a tax on the right to strike and the right to protest, and the Monbiot bingo card would be complete. So next slide. The Atlas Network. And I deliberately chose this photo because some suggest that it's sort of tinfoil hat wearing material. And excuse me while I don my tinfoil hat, but I do think that there is a gaping hole in our electoral law, which means that overseas interference is very possible. Next slide. First bullet point, Atlas Network was founded in 1981 by Anthony Fisher, a British entrepreneur. The intent was to connect various think tanks via a global network. It's described as a think tank that creates think tanks. It has relationships with more than 500 organisations in nearly 100 countries. And importantly, it's noted for promoting interests of tobacco and fossil fuel industries. And it has received funding from oil, coal and tobacco interests. Next slide. You have to just click on the window itself. Yeah, click on the white. Yeah, keep going through. Yep. That's good. And Atlas network links to New Zealand. Well, there are lots and lots of them, but here's just a few. David Seymour previously worked for the Canadian Frontier Centre for Public Policy, which has links to Atlas. Next bullet point, Taxpayers Union has acknowledged long-standing links to Atlas. New Zealand Initiative also has long-standing links. Hobson's Pledge has been linked to the network. And the newly appointed minister, Casey Costello, who came out of nowhere and suddenly found her way into cabinet, she has strong links with the Taxpayers Union and Hobson's Pledge, and her fast tracking is unusual because she seems to have a job of winding back smoking reforms, which is one of the things that it's a pet hate of Atlas. And the next slide, just a few comments about Atlas in the UK. The Institute of Economic Affairs is deeply linked to them. And the IEA performs the same sort of job that the Taxpayers Union does over here. They're a go-to media organisation. They're platformed on UK media 14 times a day. There are two peers who previously worked for the organisation who the Conservatives put into the House of Lords. And about the Monbiot says, the dark money junk tanks and the Atlas network are a highly effective means of disguising and aggregating power. Next slide, please. And this has got a video which I'll get Jan to start in just a minute. But it's a clip from the Mihirangi Forbes documentary Trick or Treaty, which you might have seen recently. And she talks about how a well-funded campaign from Advance Australia, which is another Atlas-associated organisation, how it supported Warren Mundine and Jacinda Nampijinpa-Price, and how their campaign turned the tide on the Voice referendum in Australia. When it started off, it looked like it would pass fairly easily. But when the votes came in, it failed. If you could start there now, Jan.
Well, both of them come out of the conservative advocacy group Advance Australia. Advance Australia pitched itself as ordinary Aussies with mainstream values, worried about what woke elites were doing to their country. But an investigation by the Australian independent news organisation Klaxon found that Advance Australia is bankrolled by actual elites, some of Australia's richest people. Advance Australia is just one of the many right-wing think tanks with links to the little-known global organisation, the Atlas Network. The network was established in 1981 to promote free market policies around the world.
The purpose of the Atlas Network was to litter the world with free market think tanks. That basically, the purpose was to create all of these institutes that would present themselves as research institutes, and to flood the world with these institutes.
There are 500 to 600 think tanks linked to Atlas with fairly innocuous names, such as the Centre for Independent Studies, where in Australia, Warren Mundine is the director.
The Centre for Independent Studies won't tell you who funds them now.
Got sound for the live stream tonight.
And that's certainly no record. They were founded by oil and gas mining uranium interests in the late 70s.
Dr. Walker studies the Atlas network. He says it receives some of its funding from oil and gas interests who oppose Indigenous rights that could threaten the fossil fuel industry. This is about rights, land rights.
It's about land rights. It's about, so one thing that's consistent across all of these Atlas Network think tanks is that we'll oppose anything that gets in the way of the fossil fuel industry, whether it's climate policy, Indigenous land rights.
Now, a warning to Māori. Free market think tanks undermined the support for the yes vote in Australia. Could that happen here if a referendum were to be held on the Treaty of Waitangi? Should we be worried about a treaty referendum?
It will be relentless, it will be very well funded, and it will be dark.
Did anyone else feel a shiver go up your spine when you think about the prospects of a referendum on the treaty, or even a select committee process on talking about a referendum on the treaty? If it's anything like what happened in Australia, I'm pretty sure that there will be publicity, and it will be relentless, it will be very well funded, and it will be dark. So, next slide, please. Yep, so what's happening in Aotearoa? Well, we've got the rollback of smoke-free reforms and a policy agenda that gives all of the appearances of coming straight from British American tobacco. There's the reintroduction of offshore oil drilling, which seems to be in the pipeline. There's the spiking of clean emissions scheme that was working really well. The Treaty Principles Bill. And there was Taxpayers Union's very well-funded campaign against Three Waters. And they're all things which Atlas tends to run campaigns about, and there's a eerie similarity of what's happened in Australia and what's happening here. Next slide. This is all about the money, and I thought we should delve into the finances of recent electoral activity. And I'm not sure if it's clear, but this is a graph showing declared donations for each of the political parties over the last 8 years. And what you can see is that the blue line is national, and yet it's always ahead of us, it's the way it is. The yellow is ACT, red is Labour, and Labour's always lower down, and we do okay, but we're certainly not wealthy. And the Greens are in a similar position to us. But that 2022, if you look at the peaks, they're all election years. So 2022, which wasn't an election year, Nationals declared donations was almost up to $5 million, and ACT was around about $2 million. So they're historical highs, and that's before election year. Next slide, please. The election year donation data isn't out, but this is the big donations over $20,000, which the parties have to report fairly quickly. And again, you can see National and ACT did extraordinarily well. New Zealand First suddenly had lots and lots of money flowing to it. And then behind that, you can see Labour and the Greens and Te Pāti Māori. But again, that just goes to show you the huge amount of money that was flowing to the right over the last 12 months. The biggest recorded donor was Graham Hart, whose rank group gave $150,000 to National, $104,000 to ACT, and $100,000 to New Zealand First. And if you ever need evidence of collusion, the wealthiest people in the country spreading their love around to those three particular parties shows the extent of the organisation that was happening. But at least donations to parties can be identified and checked. Registered promoters, which includes Taxpayers Union. Next slide, please. They're entirely different. So first of all, this is a slide showing taxpayers' unions' income, which is the blue line, and reserves, which is the yellow line. And you can see a massive shift over the last couple of years. Last year, they received nearly $3 million in donations. And man, the Labour Party wished it received that sort of money. And they had $1 million in reserves. And that was the year before election year. You can pretty well guarantee that last year they did even better. So just that one entity itself has got a huge amount of resources that it's obviously being used to support the right. Next slide, please. So the problem with registered promoters is, although they can't be an overseas person, so they have to be a local corporation or local individuals, and there's a legislative ban on overseas persons being registered promoters. Next slide, please. We don't know how they're funded. So they have to file electoral returns, but when they do that, all they have to do is talk about electoral expenses, and they don't have to say where the money came from. And next slide, please. Unlike parties and candidates, there's absolutely no restriction on a registered promoter receiving money from overseas. So yeah, let that sink in. There's no restriction on Taxpayers Union or any other registered promoter from getting money from overseas. So in theory, Atlas or its supporters or rich Australian mining interests or conservative American entities could be pouring money into these organisations to fund activity. And we'd never know. Next slide, please. So Taxpayers Union is an incorporated society, so it does have to file some information publicly. And this is a screenshot from what it filed in 2022. But that's all that you can see is donations, 2.601 million, membership subscriptions, 187,000, and there's no clue about where their money came from. And next slide. And that's its electoral return. So $371,000 is what it declared it spent on certain election activities. Doesn't cover all of its activity, just essentially advertising. And this is an organisation that last year paid for polling at the national and electorate level, issued almost 100 press releases, hosted 7 political debates, published 4 policy reports, started a petition, drafted alternative legislation, and rolled out that awful debt clock gimmick. But it did all that with money that it had got from somewhere. And if only the left had a similarly resourced entity to drive policy formation and public opinion. So next slide. This is an even more unusual entity that appeared recently. So this is Vote for Better Limited, who was another organisation that registered to be a registered promoter. All you can see from the Companies Office record is who the director and shareholder is, and that person owns a creative agency which claims an ability to transform brands and help businesses thrive in a competitive world. And maybe he chose to engage in the election campaign of his own volition. Maybe he had an axe to grind, but it was reported in Radio New Zealand. Vote for Better hasn't pushed for any particular party, but its advertising is focused on critiquing the current government's performance. Some of its video ads are narrated with an American accented artificial intelligence voiceover. Being a private company, there's no obligation whatsoever for it to file any financial returns publicly. So we've got no idea at all where it got the money from. Next slide, please. But it spent $386,514 on campaigning which was close to the cap. Next slide. There's the Hei Arotaki Potitanga Motuhake, which is the independent electoral review. They've dug into things and they've made a few proposals. One of them is that individual voters only should donate, and there should be a cap of $30,000. And they've also said that third-party promoters should disclose all donations over $30,000. And the quote from the report is, "We recommend addressing an existing vulnerability in our system by preventing registered third-party promoters using money from overseas persons to fund election advertising in the 3 months before an election." And their recommendations are being considered by Paul Goldsmith, but I don't hold out much hope. So there's a lot of focus on Atlas, but to be honest, it's not exclusively a problem with Atlas. Wealthy throughout the world are willing to fund anything to preserve their privilege. We could defeat Atlas. Something else would pop up, and we'd be engaged in whack-a-mole all the time. What we need to start, though, is to get the laws reformed so that at least these entities have to disclose to us how they're being funded and who they're being funded by. So going back to George Monbiot, another quote from his excellent article. "These junktards are like the spike proteins on a virus. They're the means by which plutocratic power invades the cells of public life and takes over. It's time we developed an immune system." And kia ora to that.
Thanks very much, Greg. It's so well researched and thoughtful. If you've got some questions to ask Greg, we will after Max has spoken, so write them down now while you're thinking about them. So the next person who is going to talk to us tonight is Max Harris, who a lot of you will already know, a campaigner and advocate and policy person. So welcome, Max. I'll get you to introduce yourself a bit more.
Kia ora tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou, ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Greg, ngā mihi nui ki ngā Fabians. Ko Max Harris aho, he Pākehā aho. It's really nice to be here with you all and with some familiar faces. Usually I like to stand up and gesticulate quite a lot, but I've been told I have to sit down for the Zoom, so I'll try and stay seated. I'm also a lawyer like Greg, so I work as a barrister at Thorndon Chambers and I work part of the week for Action Station, and I also do some writing. But I'm going to present a slightly different perspective from Greg tonight. I think Atlas is a problem, and I think Atlas is part of the problem, but I don't think it's the whole problem. And I think there are some risks in seeing Atlas as the whole problem, which I'll try to explain. So I'll start by kind of acknowledging why Atlas is a problem. Then I'll try to talk about the bigger problem, the bigger New Zealand neoliberal machine. And I want to not just talk about the problem, but I also want to talk about alternatives, how we dismantle that together. So if we could push one slide forward, please, Jan, thank you. So why Atlas is part of the problem. So to me, it's clear Atlas does exist and it wields significant power and resources. Also, New Zealand has strong links to Atlas. So for example, the chair of the Atlas board is Debbie Gibbs, and that's the person in the middle up here. Debbie Gibbs is a New Zealander, and I believe she's the daughter of Alan Gibbs, who some of you might know. So in some ways, Atlas might be seen as the child of New Zealand, and I'll come back to that phrase. Also, I think one important fact about seeing Atlas as a problem is I know that in recent weeks there's been a lot of interest in Atlas, and it's been a way-in for people to understand neoliberalism and to think about power in this country. So I spoke to someone earlier in the week who said, since coming across Atlas, you know, I've been looking up neoliberalism, I've been thinking about the 80s and 90s. This is a positive thing. We want people to be thinking about how power has been built up in this country, and if Atlas can help people to understand that, then that's all well and good. Lastly, I think international funders and networks have definitely emboldened right-wing causes, and not just on economic justice issues, but also, as Greg was saying as well, on racial justice issues, on gender justice issues, and I think we should be alert to that. And I think another example of a writer who's been particularly good at mapping the right internationally is Naomi Klein, and her latest book, Doppelganger, is a really excellent example where she sort of admits to sitting down and watching Steve Bannon videos all day and figuring out what the right is doing. And I think we should be doing that on the left. If we could just move to the next slide. Now I want to come to the but, or the however. I really don't think Atlas should be central to our analysis, and let me explain why. And I actually think Greg and I are probably broadly on the same page. I'm not trying to differentiate myself too much from Greg, and we've talked about this. But first of all, I think putting Atlas at the center of our analysis is a little bit too easy in trying to overcome the market society we have. It's a little bit too easy because it suggests that there's a few people kind of controlling everything, and if we just kind of got hold of those few people, we might be able to have a different system. And unfortunately, I think the challenge in front of us is a lot more difficult than that, because the fact is, since the 80s and 90s, policies around privatization and deregulation and lower taxes have become, if not popular, then supported by a large section of the public. And we need to understand why that is the case and how we shift that public. So it's a little bit too easy, but in another respect, putting Atlas at the center makes things also a little bit too hard, because it suggests that actually this distant force is controlling everything, and I think it's a bit disempowering for all of us who want to be able to do something to change the society that we're in. And I think any account of power that we have has to be empowering of us, it has to give us agency, and it has to make us believe that change might be possible, and I think change is possible. I also think if we put Atlas at the center of our analysis, we potentially don't look around at power in New Zealand and how that has been built up and how we can map that. And Greg did talk about the taxpayers union and our laws, and I'm going to try and do a little bit more at mapping kind of the right now in New Zealand, and I think it's really urgent that we do that to take on this government and to take on the right. Lastly, I think putting Atlas at the center of our analysis gets cause and effect the wrong way round. I think Atlas is an effect of the successful neoliberal project rather than the cause of it, and I'll explain more why in a moment. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Just stepping back, and without wanting to be too theoretical, I think one way of understanding this is thinking about power in two ways. One is in terms of like puppet theories of power, and another is what might be called kind of machine theories of power. And this is pretty rough and ready, but I think it might be helpful. So puppet theories of power say there's several people who kind of have the puppet strings and are controlling the world. And unfortunately, quite a lot of people right across the political spectrum have fallen for these theories of power. And we hear people saying that Davos elites control everything, that the WHO with its SDGs, or the UN with its SDGs, is controlling the puppet strings. And I unfortunately think some versions of explanations based on Atlas can fall into this kind of approach to power. And I think a problem with this is it's certainly true that a small number of people hold a lot of wealth and power in our society, and that is wrong. But this account doesn't really explain how they got that power, how they maintained that power, and how we changed that power. So another way of thinking about power is in terms of a machine, and sort of machine theories of power. And this sees power as being built through multiple parts. It also sees power as being fed into something that then transforms it into something bigger. And it sees power as sort of self-sustaining, so that once the kind of lever is cranked and the machine is going, it can maintain itself. And I think that's a more helpful way of understanding power in this country than to think about puppets, even though I think Atlas is real, and I think Atlas is part of the problem. By the way, if we really want to get theoretical, I think there's some other really good work that's been done on a kind of ruling power. In particular, someone that I've learned a lot from, for people who are interested in reading more, is someone called Nikos Palantzas, who talks not just about kind of the ruling class, but how fractions of classes are an alliance, and how alliances are built between different fractions in order to build ruling power. But I want to get kind of practical, and I want to get kind of helpful for us thinking about how we take on this government. So, how was the machine of New Zealand neoliberalism built up? I've drawn a lot here on the work of Jane Kelsey, and in particular her book, The New Zealand Experiment. But I've just got 10 quick points up here. People can analyze this in different ways. I probably haven't covered everything, but I think this provides a slightly broader perspective than just thinking about some puppets controlling the system, or just thinking about the program, because it's certainly true that the Atlas program is similar to the New Zealand neoliberal program, the UK neoliberal program, but that program has been implemented in particular ways that we have to understand. So how has it been achieved and implemented? Well, first of all, as we know, in the 80s under the fourth Labour government, and in the 90s in the national government, which I think sometimes doesn't get as much blame as it should, there were radical policy changes, right? The top tax rate went from 66% to 33%. The privatization of assets happened, deregulation happened, the rules around markets were loosened. Many people in the audience will be very familiar with this. I don't mean to kind of go over old ground. But secondly, it wasn't just a set of policies that were rolled through. The infrastructure of government was changed, right? The state sector was changed. It was redesigned along company lines so that departments were seen as competitive with each other rather than an integrated, unified mode of government. As well, it's quite important to state the obvious, the left was co-opted in this project. The Labour Party was co-opted in this project. Unions were weakened, in particular through the Employment Contracts Act. Why was that important? Because in every workplace, resources were extracted from employees and employers were enriched, but also out in the streets, unions were weakened as a force for social good. Fourthly, there was a massive transfer of power and wealth to the wealthiest, who often tended to be Pākehā. Often a small number of people, and this is where, you know, the puppet theory of power gets close to being right. There were people out there that were appointed to positions of power, Roderick Dean, Brierley, many other, Ron Trotter, not Brierley, but we can also talk about Brierley. Many individuals who were enriched through privatization, Rich Right, which is an amazing name given what happened. All these individuals that we're very aware of, but it was important that there was this power and wealth transferred. Also importantly, law was an instrument of this. So law was used to lock in these changes so that they weren't just superficial one-off changes. It wasn't just this program that was a passing fad, but we had things like the Public Finance Act and the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which were kind of quasi-constitutional in Jane Kelsey's words. They were presented as sort of higher laws that were seen as immutable, and locking in principles, for example, of prudent public debt, low public debt. Why is it that we're obsessed with keeping public debt low and having public debt that's far lower than many similarly situated countries? It's partly because prudent public debt is locked into the Public Finance Act. I won't go on for too long, but you know the rest of this. Dismantling the social state, including bashing beneficiaries, and expanding at the same time, this is important, the punitive state. So it wasn't just a shrinking of the state, it was a shrinking of the social state and an expansion of the state around prisons and defence and a punitive welfare state. So it was more a shifting of the interests in which the state was acting and the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. At the same time, there was very strategic weakening of other progressive bases, including students and universities. And then the think tanks came in, not as drivers of this change, in my view, or only partially as drivers, but in particular to sustain the changes that were already there, to legitimize, to rationalize, to give arguments for why those changes should be entrenched and maintained. And all of this was also fed through the pre-existing colonial grid and the pre-existing capitalist grid, which meant that Māori were particularly disproportionately affected by unemployment in the early 1990s, which meant that this happened in a very particular way in this country. And the ultimate goal was to entrench a new set of reigning values, right? And that was the Thatcher project as well. As the method was economics, the object was to change the soul, to paraphrase Thatcher. That was the project. It was more than just puppets, it was more like a machine, and I think this diagram gives a sense of it. Now here's my very rough and ready attempt to map a little bit of New Zealand right now, because I think we should all be doing this and you could all come up with better diagrams than me, because I don't do very good diagrams, but I've tried to do this a little bit on the board, on the PowerPoint. And I should have added, I did this quite quickly, but I should have added the Taxpayers Union. There's just quite a few think tanks here. But what I want to say here is, how has the machine kept going? Because clearly we didn't revert back to a different society after the early 90s. We had a system in place that entrenched this. And part of this is that there has been ongoing privatization, ongoing deregulation, ongoing tax cuts and denigration of progressive tax change. and a co-opting of the left, including at a local government level. Networks of power have been critical to maintaining this, and this is where, you know, the puppet theory like almost gets something right in that there are power networks, but I think they're much more complicated. At the same time, when we map them out and we all have different pictures, I think we can identify sites of power which can allow us to be really clear in who we're challenging. And I've just mapped some of these up here. So I've got a kind of web of think tanks, including the New Zealand Initiative, the Free Speech Union, Hobson's Pledge, with some little cousin organisations, including the New Zealand Centre for Political Research. And what I think is crucial is the networks that these have with both the ACT Party and the National Party. I could go on for quite a long time specifically talking about this. For example, David Farrar, who's been very involved in the Free Speech Union and several of these initiatives, and is also the pollster for the National Party, or Stephen Franks, who's involved with the Free Speech Union and is a former MP for the ACT Party, or Muriel Newman, who's involved with the New Zealand Centre for Political Research, former MP for the ACT Party, Hobson's Pledge, heavily associated with Don Brash, member of both the National Party and the ACT Party. Business funders crucial to both the New Zealand Initiative in particular and the ACT Party and Hobson's Pledge, and to be honest, this whole network. I think we need to be doing more of this kind of mapping, and you could do a more detailed map based on individuals that you're aware of. And I think there's a really interesting story to be told in New Zealand as well of a certain set of families that have had a lot of power. I mentioned before Alan Gibbs and his daughter Debbie Gibbs. And in that sense, you know, Atlas was a child of New Zealand's success. But you've also got John Bishop, founding member of the Taxpayers Union, father of Chris Bishop. You've got the Quigley family involved in the 1980s, also now involved in the Reserve Bank, and many other examples of this. But I actually think when we map this out in this way, the target does become messy, but it also becomes something we can grasp onto and something that we can clearly challenge with well-coordinated responses. I won't go on for too long, but I do want to end on a positive note, and I want to talk about what we can all do. So how do we take the machine apart? In my view, there are 3 steps. First of all, mapping what the machine is doing. And by that, I mean being really clear not just about where power lies right now and where it has laid since the 80s and 90s, but also mapping the agendas in the here and now. And I think it's very clear already what the government's agendas are. There's an attack on Māori and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, again, including with the Treaty Principles Bill, which I think is probably the most dangerous piece of legislation in the last 20 years. There's an attempt to decimate unions again with the scrapping of the fair pay agreements. There's bashing of beneficiaries again with a traffic light sanction system, with a system of approved pools of doctors for people with long-term health and disabilities, some of the most cruel policies for people who are really in need. There's a systematic attempt going on right now to privatise local government assets all around the country that we need to wake up to. An attempt to sell off Wellington Airport, an attempt to sell off assets in Taranaki and Christchurch, and in Auckland right here, an attempt in the long-term plan over the next 10 years to sell off not just the remaining Auckland Airport shares, but also the Auckland Port and our parks, and a further program of privatisation for the next 10 years. Submissions close on that at the end of this month. The 3 options that Wayne Brown has presented are 3 options of more or less privatisation. $300 million worth of privatisation over 3 years, or 10 years, or $20 to $30 million of privatisation. It's being rammed down our throats at a local government level, and we need to be very clear about the agendas at play. Lastly, we see vicious public service cuts again, and we could also talk about climate change, as Greg rightly did, and the bringing back of oil and gas, in essence, both through the fast-track approvals bill and the reintroduction of oil and gas offshore exploration. So let's map those agendas and be clear about them. Let's stand up to those agendas, secondly, and throw sand into the gears of the machine. This is about not just speaking up, but speaking up really strategically and acting collectively, building relationships, because that's what we can do on the left. We don't have the resources of the right, but we have people power and we have more of us. And that means that if we're coordinated, we can oppose the Treaty Principles Bill. We have to all submit in this room on the Treaty Principles Bill, which is trying to erase tino rangatiratanga and erase Māori rights in Te Tiriti. That is an absolute disgrace. It is an absolute overreach, and we have to make sure that doesn't pass. We have to make sure that the The citizens-initiated referendum that's lying behind that is not allowed to pass either. We have to defend and rebuild unions in a strategic way and work with our comrades in the union movement. We have to stand up for beneficiaries. Actually, a majority of New Zealand thought the benefit increases in 2021 didn't go far enough. I don't believe a majority of New Zealanders support beneficiary bashing, but we have to stand up and say that and talk back at those people who would suggest otherwise. We have to stand up against the privatization of local public assets, because that will make us into more of a market society. And more market values of competitiveness and individualism, and we have to stand up against public service cuts, for all that the public service might be a complicated beast right now. And this, I promise, will be the last slide. Final step in trying to take apart the New Zealand neoliberal machine is to unwind and replace that machine. And for that, we need a strong progressive agenda. We need the Labour Party and the Green Party and Te Pāti Māori and all other progressives in the movement to have a coordinated, unified, bold progressive agenda. But we can't just have a program, we also need progressive infrastructure. Some of the things we might want in that agenda are bringing things back into public control that have been left out since they were privatised or made into SOEs in the 80s and 90s, including our energy companies. It means making the case proudly for progressive taxation and not believing that our progressive tax is a bad word or a swear word. It means planning for new employment relations legislation, which I think the last Labour government potentially could have done more on. It means rebuilding union power, ensuring Te Tiriti o Waitangi is cemented and honoured, and being deliberate about how we shrink market power so that we become less of a market society. And one way we do that is through universal services like free dental, which says some things are too important for the market and we need to take some things out of the market, like dental, to make us less of a market society. The kind of progressive infrastructure we need is, yes, some of our own think tanks, but also progressive media, progressive law centres, and other progressive institutions. And through this, we can build a different set of values that we can champion as a society, and a different kind of ethos. And that's how we win back power. That's how we understand power in a more sophisticated way. And thanks to Greg for opening up this conversation.
That was great, thank you. Now we've got some questions. This one's for both Max and Greg. Is New Zealand being subjected at present to shock doctrine as described by Naomi Stein in her book?
I'm afraid probably. You just have to look at the number of urgent pieces of legislation going through Parliament. It's up to 18 or 19, I've been keeping count. And a lot of them are just stuff that normal course of events they should be talking to us about. But they're just smashing them through without any concern about the effects. And some of David Seymour's recent behaviour, for instance, attacks on the media, that really does suggest to me strongly that they are interested in almost a Trumpian approach to politics, where you just get the division line drawn and just smash through what you can. So I'm afraid quite possibly.
Just really quickly, I agree. So the shock doctrine, for anyone who's not aware of it, although probably most people are, is the idea of like using a shock like an economic recession or even a war in order to try to push through right-wing economic ideas, in particular like privatization and deregulation. And Naomi Klein talks about Chile, but also I think New Zealand has been used as an example of this. I'd agree. The only thing I would say is that like the shock doctrine is something that's been used like repeatedly in New Zealand, neoliberal history in particular. I think probably every local government budget in Auckland under Wayne Brown will be a shock doctrine budget, where we'll be told, we've got a fiscal crisis, we need to sell things off, we need to rush to do things that happened last year, will happen this year. I think we're going to get it from this government. They're going to continue to open the books and suggest that there are economic shocks. We need like the economists to help us push back, because there will be dodgy use of numbers. There will be an attempt to create a shock. And as India Logan Riley put it quite well last year, the reason they're doing this is because privatization isn't popular. It's because cuts are not popular. So the right does this to say, we've got no other choice. Usually you wouldn't support this, but you're going to be forced to support this. And that's why it's so important to challenge the premise of that.
Does religion play a part in the overall network? Thinking about Luxon's upper room example.
Yeah, I think it's complicated with religion. I think the far right has a fraction that's made up of the Christian right, and I think Brian Tamaki and others form part of that, and could well be kind of wheeled out in support of various measures that the right is trying to push through. But I also think, yeah, religious spaces in New Zealand are really diverse, and there are some progressive fractions of the religious community in New Zealand. And I think actually one challenge is kind of building up those progressive fractions to challenge power. And Aaron Hendry is one interesting writer and youth worker who comes from an explicitly Christian perspective. And he was talking to me about how Bob McCroskey, I think it is, from Family First, built up his following among Christian communities very deliberately through use of kind of Christian radio, and networked with people to build up the kind of right Christian fraction. I think there are possibly, I'm not an expert on this, but other kind of progressive or left strands of different religious communities that could be built up with strategy.
To be frank, when I look at the government, I don't see Luxon as being a strong leader, and I don't see his values as driving what he wants to achieve. Right now, Peters and Seymour are running rings around him, and you look at the weird policy things that are bubbling up to the top. It's not. If John Key was in power, it wouldn't be the sort of thing that he would tolerate. So. Yeah, I'm aware of Luxon's background, but I'm not sure that he's that much in control. So,
perhaps he needs to pray a bit more. So, could you comment on the place of law and order issues to build public acceptance or blindness to other things that are happening, like the boot camps and the gangs, etc.?
So. The law and order stuff, I've practiced criminal law for many, many years, and I've worked for young people. Actually, I've represented young people since the 80s. And the stuff they're proposing is sort of not really that important. It's a bit on the edge, to be honest. The gang stuff, it'll have pretty limited effect. You'll have the odd gang member who'll get a fine, but otherwise life will continue. The boot camp stuff, there'll be very, very few young people who will be subject to that penalty. And when they do the reviews, they'll see that what Labour was doing with its wraparound policies works a lot better. And so the system will adjust, and it won't care too much about what they want to achieve. But it's certainly, it's raw meat for their base, isn't it? That's why they're doing it. They're wanting to make a political statement rather than actually address a problem.
Yeah, maybe just three real quick points. So number one, I think agreeing with Greg, there are a lot of like really reheated, tired criminal justice policies like boot camps, 3 strikes, which are awful policy with no evidence, but will have damaging effects on young people's lives and people's lives and their families. Number two, I think it's important to think about like the function of criminal justice policies in this overall agenda, because sometimes it can seem strange that you've got like the shrinking of a state and then the expansion of the criminal justice state. And I think part of the function of it is to silence dissent and people who are difficult and people that don't comply with the vision of society that the right want, which is a society at the service of employers, at the service of the workplace. And I think that's the function as well as being red meat to the base. And the third point is when you think about mapping the right, the networks between NGOs and groups outside of government and government are quite close. And I think there is something for the left to think about around how, and this is relevant, I'll explain in a moment, around the government maintaining better relationships with advocacy groups. And I think there has, in the last 10 years, been some really excellent criminal justice advocacy work done outside of government, groups like Just Speak and People Against Prisons Aotearoa. And I think that the government could have done more while it was in government, to build relationships and maintain relationships with groups that could have defended its agenda. And I think what happened instead was there was a bit of a vacuum that was left despite some quite good things being done quietly, and that has meant that the right has been able to fill that vacuum. But that's a longer conversation.
These are some great questions. Now, this one just really for Greg, who talked about funding 3 months before the election. And this person comments that up to August 2023, so it was 3 months before last election, National spent a huge amount of money promoting their candidates.
Yes, I certainly saw the evidence of that. And the 3-month period is the control period where all your expense counts. So when their return gets filed later in the year, then it'll be a chance for us to have a good look and see exactly what they did. And I'm suspecting that we're going to see that they spent record amount of money, and that we were just swamped with it. You could see from that graph I put up earlier that the year before election year that they had way more money than ever. And this year, last year, I suspect that they did even better than that.
Sorry, I don't want to talk too much, but relevant to like timing, I think the timing is really important around electoral laws. Both Greg and I were involved in the campaign for the late Efessel Collins for Mayor of Auckland, and I want to pay tribute to Efessel and everyone in this room who supported his campaign. I know there were some in this room. One thing that we really noticed in that campaign was that Wayne Brown was able to self-fund a huge amount before the electoral limits kicked in. So the electoral limits kicked in quite soon, similarly to the national level, before the local elections. And before that, Wayne Brown had funded daily ads in the New Zealand Herald and I think daily TV clips. And he was able to do that with his own money, and there was no restriction on that. So that's another area of the law that has to change.
We haven't got time for any more questions, but I've got a whole sheaf here, so we're going to keep on going. Is the privatisation of local government assets really a strand of deliberate neoliberalism, or simply the bind we find ourselves in as a result of decades of complacency and incompetence within local government decision-making?
Probably a bit of both. But I will say this about Auckland and the mayor. Last budget, previous year, we had to sell Auckland Airport shares because we had to pay debt off and save some money. And a few of us on the left, we were pointing out to him, but these shares, they produce really good income and the money comes in. and so it's not a simple equation. And this year, he's proposing that we sell the shares off, but we put it into this new fund. And this new fund's going to generate 7.5% return. And it's like, Mr. Mayor, last time you were saying we just had to pay debt off there and don't take into account the income. And now you're saying sell the shares so you can get the income. So he's applying a relatively sophisticated approach to try and get a majority on Auckland Council to support it. And that's why we almost bet him last year, and he's changed his approach this year to try and get the numbers. But as Smack said earlier, it's please make a submission on it. Don't sell. Every time we sell an asset, we go backwards. It's just as clear as that.
Yeah, and just to say something about the Future Fund, I mean, that's nothing new. It's if you look at what Thatcher said and proposed and what was proposed here, almost every time there's been a privatisation, it said, oh, we can ring fence this money and reinvest it into the community. I mean, the Future Fund is just another version of that. So please don't be fooled by that, and please don't buy that it's all council incompetence, because, I mean, Auckland has a very good credit rating. Auckland's debt is not wild, as Bernard Hickey was pointing out in the last year. So we were sold the story, and I know Greg was pushing back on this as well, but this is very much part of neoliberalism, because if you look at the law as well, the law locks in a particular way of doing government. So the Super City law, passed by Rodney Hyde, ACT Party, says that generally, Auckland Council can't run a budget deficit, which is a very odd situation. Usually local and central governments can run budget deficits if they want to invest, or if there's an exceptional year, such as in a global pandemic. And that means they're forced into a position of cutting and selling. There are exceptions. You can decide to run a budget deficit, but yeah, this is part of neoliberalism. And why it's so important is the more we privatize things, the more we allow market values to seep through all of our society. So we should ask, why is our society so focused on the individual? Why is our society so focused on what is competitive? It's because we've made the public realm smaller and smaller.
Now, the next questioner wants us to discuss education, and talking about the chair of the Education Refresh Committee, is it? He is Dr. Michael Johnston. He's a PhD researcher at the New Zealand Institute. I think this is the advisory committee to the new Minister for Education, is that right? Yeah.
Can't say I know the detail, but I understand it's wrapped up in phonetics versus other ways of teaching language, and he's a firm adherent of the alternative view, and that may be the reason for his appointment.
Yeah, I've heard some positive things actually about that particular approach to education, but it is an example of the New Zealand Initiative's influence in government. And the other point that I just wanted to make, that you might have seen in my map, is that the UK Conservative Party has a great deal of influence on the New Zealand National Party and also the New Zealand Initiative. If you look at and the Taxpayers Union, just take a look at the websites and look at the backgrounds of some of the people that work there, and some of those connections are quite interesting.
This question is a cousin of the one about religion. Can you talk about the links between neoliberalism in New Zealand and authoritarian ideology? That is, Seymour's attacks on academics, particularly Wahine Māori academics, moving towards not trusting academics and research.
I think this is quite a politically fruitful way of challenging Seymour, because Seymour would like to say he's like a free marketeer in favour of personal freedom, but to get the radical change he wants, he has to be quite heavy-handed. So the Treaty Principles Bill is an attempt to stamp the ACT Party version of Te Tiriti o Waitangi onto the whole of New Zealand. And I think suggesting, if not saying that it's authoritarian, but suggesting that this is a power grab by a party that supposedly wants the state to be small, I think is a fruitful contradiction.
Yeah, I wonder if the motivation is just Trumpian, that he sees it works in America, and so he thinks he'll engage in the same sort of behaviour. I mean, ACT are a 7 or 8% party. They don't need to get a majority. They just need to lock in their 8%, and they're going to be there forever.
Thank you. Now we're moving on to News Hub, the demise of News Hub. So one questioner asks, do you think that the demise of News Hub opens up the way for a Murdoch presence in New Zealand? But another questioner asks, do you agree that the commercialising of TVNZ and its influence over New Zealand on air funding has played a role in the neoliberalising of Aotearoa? And do you see an opportunity now for a regrowing progressive media?
Just about Murdoch, he's here already, isn't he? So, certainly the News Hub and TVNZ are showing the issues with the traditional media, and they're showing that the conventional model didn't work. As a strong lefty, I'd prefer that we actually got back to more strong state funding of our media. And Radio New Zealand do a fine job. TVNZ, their commercial imperative means that it's hard to spot the difference between them and other entities sometimes. So I would just like the government to be brave and say that you need media for a properly functioning democracy, and you need to spend money on that. And this idea that it's got to make a profit is an anathema to that idea.
I'm not an expert on media one point about Murdoch is, Murdoch is obviously a particularly bad example of privatised media, but I think sometimes it's a bit of a distraction in that we should be focusing more on privatised media, and New Zealand already has, such an overwhelmingly privatised media. I also think there's a case for stronger public broadcasting. Of course, the last Labour-led government did try to bring in an RNZ, TVNZ public broadcaster merger, which could have paved the way for that. I think, again, relationships with outside groups and outside campaigning could have done more to rescue that or save that, although there's a lot that could be said about that. I'll leave it there.
I'm just wondering if, David, you would like to make a comment. I know that you've been really involved in public media and you're a good lefty. Have you got something you'd like to comment, come down and have a comment about that? You have to come and use the microphone.
To summarise my perspective on it and my experience of it, I came here from the UK, where I was a public media practitioner in the early 90s, and the system here was very, very, very weighted towards commercial criteria for programming. Things were not shown, not bought from overseas, and not commissioned and produced here if they didn't conform to very strong commercial criteria. The situation currently with New Zealand On Air funding is, there's a kind of change going on now, but it's been that the broadcaster, the platform, needs to make a significant contribution to the costs of a program to trigger the New Zealand On Air funding. Now, if the criteria of the platforms are commercial criteria for the programming that they will commission, then they will only put up their broadcasting contributions towards New Zealand On Air for things that they consider commercially viable and successful and likely to earn them advertising dollars. So that's been I could go into more detail about what's changing now, but that's been the barrier towards more progressive media, particularly in television. The answer to this, yes, is to have a strong public media entity. There were some issues with what Labour was proposing and in the last government, and sorry, I'm almost finished. But one of the key issues was how it was funded, and inevitably, in a cost of living crisis, etc., the idea that it was going to cost a large amount of tax money from the existing tax base was inevitably going to make that difficult. The answer, if we want to have a strong public media entity, is to have it resourced by ring-fenced funding from an alternative source. And what Better Public Media has been proposing here for some time has been a broad-based levy on advertising on streaming platforms and a range of other digital and audiovisual services and products. That would, if that was ring-fenced, that would potentially very well fund, or reasonably fund, a strong public media entity. Thanks for that.
Thank you, David.
Real briefly, I was just going to make a general point about, thanks, it was great to have your expertise, a general point about corporatisation as part of the kind of project of the 80s and 90s, where it was sort of halfway towards privatisation, but things were kept in the public service but had to be commercialised and corporatised, which is in some ways the worst of both worlds, in that it allowed people to be fed up that things that were meant to serve public good couldn't do it because they had to be commercialised. KiwiRail is another example of an entity that currently kind of sits halfway between, and so can't invest large sums in building like an inter-regional passenger rail network.
Right, this is someone who's been reading Gandhi, obviously. Do you think non-violent resistance will be effective in changing the neoliberal system?
That's a tough one. Actually, I've thought Tangata Whenua's recent stand against what ACT is trying to do has been given us a very good example of how to respond. So with passion, with pride, don't take a step back, but do it in a peaceful, such a way that they can't make allegations against you that you're, somehow not playing the game properly. So I think that's the example we should follow.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question is it better, someone's asked two questions, is it better to target single issues or call out overarching issues, influence, strategies, ideologies?
Now we're really getting into like general questions for the left here. I think it depends on the context, but I think there's so much that can be targeted right now in terms of single issues, like the attacks on beneficiaries, the inconsistency with Luxon claiming a $52,000 housing allowance, attacks on Māori, attacks on the climate. I think what is helpful is to try to join the dots between the single issues and to show how this fits with a particular vision of the world on the right and how there is another vision and how there is an alternative, and we do live in a society, for all that the right would say otherwise.
For the left, I've always thought it important that we have a certain style about us. So the issues are important, but it's the feeling of hope and of positivity, which I think marks our successful campaigns that we need to get back to. And last year it didn't feel quite so much like that. But I do think that we need to get back to the ethos of Mickey Savage and Norman Kirk and David Lange, and just try and create that sort of atmosphere again about progressive politics, to persuade people that it's in the common good and that we're doing our best to make sure things improve for everyone.
And this is the last question. It's about Posey Parker, who was the woman who came out about this time last year. Can you explain how gender issues and the visit of Posey Parker attracted the far right? Think about it, isn't it? Yeah.
I can't have a you, Max.
Yeah, well, the far right has built alliances when thinking about fractions with a group of anti-trans activists, and so opposition to Posey Parker was used by the far right to try to embolden its own causes. And yeah, we should always be looking for these causes that the far right is trying to use to embolden itself. But yeah, I want to end on a positive note. So I hope what we've said doesn't leave you feeling totally dispirited. I think seeing all the networks of power can be quite bleak, but everyone's here tonight. Yeah, relationships are stronger on the left. We're less transactional, like we believe in people, and yeah, I really do believe, and sorry if it sounds cliched, but yeah, we can take this on and we need to build a different kind of society if we're going to survive, and I think we can.
Thank you, well said. This session will be uploaded onto the Fabian's website. So if you want to share this with friends and you think, there's so many ideas and good thinking that's gone on tonight, that's one of the things you can do is find this article. It'll be up in the next day or so. Find this session and share it with friends, because I think this is some really important matters that we have to really get our heads around. So Thank you both, Greg and Max. I think you've both done a great job of looking from slightly different angles at exactly what is happening. And thank you to you, the audience, who've raised so many pertinent questions and linked them all together. I'm going to pass on to Paul now, who seems to want the microphone.
And thank you to Gabriel for being our moderator. Thank you.